Hello, my name's David Runciman, and this is Past, Present, Future, the History of Ideas podcast. Today, as part of the episodes that were recorded live at the Regent Street Cinema in London for our Films of Ideas series, I'm going to be talking to the philosopher and writer Nikhil Krishnan about a film that really is about ideas. It is Derek Jarman's Wittgenstein. It was released in 1993. It's very short. It's only 70 minutes long, but in those 70 minutes, it packs not just a version of the story of Wittgenstein's life, but also a really interesting exploration of his philosophy. And that is what we're talking about. As usual, I want to just give a brief introduction to the film because the conversation you'll hear is in front of an audience who have just seen it, and you listening may well not have. Derek Jarman's Wittgenstein was originally planned to be made for TV and to be even shorter than 70 minutes. But the script that was partly written by Terry Eagleton, the film was produced by Tariq Ali, was thought to be something that deserved a cinema release. But it's a pretty unconventional cinema film. It is, apart from anything else, very stagey because it was all shot in a studio. It was shot over just 12 days. It is very minimalist, pretty minimalist sets, costumes. It looks like watching a theatrical production, but it really works on the big screen. And it does try to tell the story of Wittgenstein's life and also to explore the meaning of his philosophy. It was a remarkable life, and it was, as you'll hear, I hope, a pretty remarkable philosophy. In those 70 minutes, we get scenes involving Wittgenstein's family, so we hear about his origins, including the story of the Wittgensteins, the Austrian Wittgensteins, from whom he came, a family known both for being unbelievably rich, one of the richest families in Europe, and also beset by tragedy. 3 of Wittgenstein's brothers committed suicide, and the film makes clear it could easily have been a 4th. Wittgenstein himself came close to suicidal despair at various points in his life. It tells the story of how Wittgenstein became a philosopher. He originally thought he was going to be an aeronautical engineer, how he wound up in Cambridge. It features characters based on the people in Wittgenstein's life in Cambridge. So there is Bertrand Russell, there is John Maynard Keynes, there is Ottoline Morell, played by Tilda Swinton. But it does also try to explore what Wittgenstein thought was at the heart of his philosophy and how the philosophical questions that tortured him related to some of the other things that tortured him in his life. Notoriously, at the end of Wittgenstein's life, his last words are reputed to have been, "Tell them it's been a wonderful life." But as seen in this film, a lot of it looks like agony. And the film captures pretty well some of the agonies of philosophy. If you really take it seriously, it takes you into some pretty, potentially bleak places. Discussing this film with me is the writer, the teacher, the philosopher Nikhil Krishnan. Nikhil's most recent book is called A Terribly Serious Adventure, Philosophy and War at Oxford, 1900 to 1960. It tells a group biographical story of philosophy in the first half of the 20th century. That book's about Oxford. This film is about Cambridge, but there's plenty of overlap. Nikhil is interested, as you'll hear, in the relationship between biography and philosophy, which was also the subject of our last episode about the film Rosa Luxemburg. This film has more philosophy in it than that film did, and there is more philosophy in the conversation that you're about to hear. But we are also talking about a really brilliant film. Nikhil, I want to start with a broad question and then ask you the specific version of that question. So it seems to me one of the things this film is suggesting is that philosophy is in some sense an extension of biography, that in order to understand the ideas, you have to know a lot about the life. So I want to ask you that in relation to Wittgenstein in a moment. But in general, given that you write philosophical biography, do you think that's true? Do you think that philosophical ideas divorced from the life of the philosopher lose something of their meaning, their truth?
I think that is true, but perhaps not in some of the cruder ways that that statement is sometimes interpreted. I think when people say that, I think there's an air of cynicism with which it's uttered, in the sense that these thinkers, these intellectuals, think that they believe things for reasons because they've been persuaded by arguments, by evidence, but really it's some neurosis, it's some
or childhood.
Yes, exactly. And if that's the claim, I suspect Wittgenstein would have been disposed to deny it. I'm disposed to deny it. I think we should go with, on the whole, with a naive picture of these things. People believe things for roughly the reasons they give for them. But it doesn't mean that there isn't another story to be told about them. It's just there are many, many questions to be asked about why people think the things they do. And one part of the answer to that is going to be because they think those things are true, and for the reasons that anyone thinks any things are true. But there's always going to be something else. Why think those things rather than something else? Is it merely a coincidence when some feature of someone's thought does seem to fit very nicely with a sort of psychoanalytic account, for instance, of why someone of that sort might believe that sort of thing? And in Wittgenstein's case, it's clear that there are a great many neuroses there, right? There's a little dismissive remark he makes along the way about Freud. He would have been a prime candidate for analysis for all sorts of reasons. He was tortured about philosophy, about nearly everything, in ways that are very hard to make sense of when you look at the actual substance of the kinds of questions he was interested in. Most of what he wrote about in his philosophy were extremely abstract, often technical questions of logic, of the nature of language, of the nature of the mind, the sorts of things. It's hard to picture anyone being really tortured about that kind of thing, but somehow he managed it. And you're really looking for an explanation of that, which it's hard to find within the substance of the ideas themselves.
But it's also the case that with Wittgenstein, it was an extraordinary life. So there is something about his life, and I don't know, I want to ask you in a bit about where his reputation stands today, but let's come on to that. But there is something about his life that perhaps grips people more than the ideas. I don't know if that's always been true, but it feels like it might be true today. It was a remarkable life. Do you think in the case of Wittgenstein, there's a particular danger that the life overshadows the ideas, or do you think it is actually possible that the life is more interesting than the ideas?
Yeah, it's a really interesting question. I mean, speaking myself as someone who has encountered Wittgenstein first within the confines of a philosophy department, I think we do tend to confront his ideas by divorcing them from his life about as much as it's possible to. But the thing about Wittgenstein, unlike most other philosophers in that kind of vein, people who wrote about problems of logic and so forth, is that he has caught the attention of people who are not academic philosophers, of poets, of musicians, of architects, and that is something remarkable. Very few figures, at least in the 20th century, have done that. And one needs some kind of explanation of why that is. So in Wittgenstein's case, it does seem like he fits better than some other academic figures a kind of folk idea of what a philosopher ought to be like. And if you want to capture that in one word, it's this feeling of depth. It's not mere cleverness. I'm sure he was very clever. He was certainly very technically adept at these hard bits of philosophy that require something either equivalent to, analogous to mathematical ability. He had that in enormous quantities, but that doesn't seem to be what makes him remarkable. What makes him remarkable is that quality of him saying something that's just beyond the sayable, just beyond language, reaching for something that's too hard to put into words. And of course, that's exactly the kind of thing that will catch the attention of a poet, of an artist, of a musician. And those people, of course, inevitably, because this stuff is difficult and technical, and some of it is, frankly, dull, if you're not really into this kind of thing, you're not going to want to look at his theory of the proposition, right? That's not the kind of thing you're going to do. So when you reach those bits of the Tractatus, you quietly skip over those bits, and then you get to the wonderful mystical aphorisms that come towards the end. So that does produce a sort of split, a schizophrenic Wittgenstein, someone who is on the one hand a logician and on the other a mystic, possibly a saint. And it seems different sorts of people are drawn to different aspects of that self. I think that's where the temptation lies, to sort of say the technical bits, they weren't really important. I mean, I think they're extremely important, and it's fair enough if some of us find them too hard to grapple with. So I think to the extent that we can resist it, we should take the technical stuff seriously if we can. but there's so much more. And that's not true to nearly the same extent for someone like Russell, who also appears in the film. There was some interesting stuff in his life, but there's something just a little bit shallow about the way in which he lived it, something a little bit facile. Things seemed to come too easily to him. He didn't seem to find things difficult. And I think that superficiality, in a way, puts people off him, and possibly people's reactions are right towards people like Russell in that respect.
I mean, the other thing that makes Wittgenstein really unusual, not just that he conforms to the ideal type of a philosopher, and not just that he had neuroses and was tortured, but he seemed to spend his life running away from doing philosophy. So we heard this in the film. Philosophy was a kind of agony to him, but also the idea of doing it. There was also always in his mind something else that he should be doing. So he started off thinking he would be an aeronautical engineer. Then when war breaks out, he thinks what he wants to do is be shot at and be a soldier. He builds himself a house. He builds his sister a house. He becomes a school teacher. He either undertakes manual work, or we don't see it in the film, hospital work as a hospital porter himself, or he encourages his students to do it. It is a unique philosophical life in that way. It's hard to think of any other philosopher who seemed to be so determined to get away from the life of a philosopher. And that clearly is part of the mystique. So there's a little bit in this about the cult of Wittgenstein and the idea that in Cambridge he was producing these disciples, half of Cambridge was going around imitating his mannerisms. Yeah. Part of the pull was clearly the pull of a man who seemed not to want to be a philosopher. And it's hard to think of any other philosopher of his stature of whom it's true to that extent. Well, or are you going to tell me there is another one?
Well, a remark that's sometimes made about philosophy, the impulse to philosophy, is that it can be moved by curiosity, or it can be moved by a desire for salvation. And most academic philosophers, I think, are moved by the first. Simple curiosity, here's a puzzle, let's sort it out. It's a problem not fundamentally unlike a problem in mathematics or physics, for instance. With Wittgenstein, it doesn't seem to have been that. He does seem to have seen philosophy as part of an effort towards salvation, to save himself from what it's hard to say. The kinds of biographies that people have written in many different styles, some more psychoanalytically inflected than others, I think say, oh, maybe it was his sexuality, this tortured, complex sexuality he was running away from. Maybe it was some complex to do with his Jewishness. Perhaps it was the inheritance of a kind of cultural neurosis that to fully understand you kind of have to have lived in Vienna at the turn of the 20th century, right? This world where you're surrounded by Freud on one street, Karl Kraus, the satirist, on the other. But Kraus, whom I've just mentioned, one of the many pointed aphorisms attributed to him is one about psychoanalysis, where he says, it is the disease to which it is itself the cure. And Wittgenstein seems to have taken something like that view of philosophy as well. Philosophy was the disease, but the way to cure the disease was to do some philosophy. But then that meant, and seems to follow from that view of philosophy, that if you don't already have the impulse to do it, thank goodness, try to keep it that way, right? Don't get infected. That's a word that appears in the film. Try not to get infected with the desire to engage in this sort of thought. It's terrible. It's terrible. But if, unfortunately, you find yourself with these thoughts, you find yourself lying awake at night, thinking about them, well, the only way to sort them out is to go through them, as it were, to do the philosophy. So one remark that Wittgenstein makes in passing is that what he's looking for in philosophy is something that would enable him to stop doing philosophy when he wanted. I think that's what it is. It's those last three words that are often omitted from that quotation. It's not simply that he wanted not to do philosophy, it's that he wanted not to be plagued by these thoughts. He wanted not to come on him unbidden. He wanted to have some control over when he indulged that particular desire. And that's what makes it a sort of therapeutic project for him. He wants to be in control of this thing that he doesn't have control over. The thoughts just come, and not wholly under his control. And that's what gets him tormented about it.
The film begins with his family, and there is a scene at one point, Russell more or less says to him, you're trying to run away from your family, you're trying to run away from Vienna. And he screams back at Russell, you keep bringing me back to that. But one of the really remarkable things about Wittgenstein is he was a unique human being. I think part of the cult of Wittgenstein recognizes it's very hard to think of anyone like him. And yet he was from a unique family, and he was a very typical member of that family. So it really was a unique family. The Wittgensteins, it's not completely conveyed in this film just how rich they were. Yeah. They were, I believe, the second richest family in Europe after the Rothschilds. They were extraordinarily cultured and musical. They knew everybody in Vienna. They were Jewish, but they raised their children as Catholics. As we did hear in the film, he had 4 brothers, 3 of whom committed suicide. They were all in their different ways tortured and seemed to be running away from something. In the case of one, almost certainly it was his sexuality. So he was a unique human being and also a quintessential product of his time, of his family, of his class. Where do you think the film strikes the balance between those two? I mean, it seems to me it actually quite skillfully captures both of those two things, but where do you think the balance lies between his uniqueness as an individual and the fact that he was a typical Wittgenstein?
Yeah, I think that's right. I think I agree with you that it strikes the balance very effectively. In one respect, he never tried to run away from Vienna. It's kind of a remarkable thing that every year during the vacations from Cambridge, which are, some people may know, quite long, he would go to Vienna nearly every year. Right? The film emphasizes the times he'd go off to a fjord in Norway and a bit of rural Ireland. Later on in his life, it was Swansea, of all places, where he went quite frequently. But he did go back to Vienna. He kept in touch with that world. And of course, that world changed quite radically over the course of his life. Over the course of the 30s, it's just not the same Vienna, because the sorts of left-wing Jewish radical thinkers who gave it that special flavor were no longer there. Some of them were dead. Some of them were in concentration camps. Some of them had fled or emigrated. So that Vienna didn't exist for him to return to as his life went on, and certainly hasn't existed really since the war. So in one sense, Vienna itself fled from him. And perhaps that explains a little why he was reconciled to being in Cambridge, much as he seems to have loathed it and loathed its social world, all these Bloomsbury intellectuals and these apostles and all this small talk at high table and which way to pass the sherry. He loathed all that, but he somehow was stuck there. I mean, where else was he going to be?
The film doesn't make much of his Jewishness. So there's a striking scene very early on where the boy, Wittgenstein, is firing a walking stick as a gun, and behind him is a tableau of Stars of David. It's mentioned, and it's true, one of the most bizarre, I guess it's a coincidence of world history, that Wittgenstein and Hitler went to the same school and they were in the same year, but Wittgenstein was moved a year ahead and Hitler was kept back a year. Read into that what you will. But it's thought they shared a history teacher at one point, but there's very little other reference to his Jewish background. But there is quite a lot made of the fact that it's at least possible that religion, in some wider sense, explains his life and his philosophy. You've touched on this, him as a mystical figure, the thought that philosophy was answering questions that have something in common with religion. Again, just thinking of this version in the film, what do you think it conveys about Wittgenstein and religion? Because actually, in some ways, I think it makes more of that than it does of his sexuality. Obviously, it makes something of his sexuality, and Derek Jarman made this film because that was one of the things that he wanted to explore. Derek Jarman, the director, was dying of AIDS when this film was being made. And this film was made, I think, in 12 days, some very, very short period of time. And it was originally intended for television. That's one of the reasons why it's so short, but it really works in the cinema. What do you think the film is trying to suggest about Wittgenstein and religion?
I have only hypotheses or conjectures about this. Here's one. One might think that religion is doing authentically, with sincerity, what it is that philosophy does as a kind of parody or caricature. What philosophy renders into mere technicality or formalism, the arguments set out in premises and conclusions, diagrams on blackboards, graphs, structures, all of that is a kind of evasion of the sort of salvation that one really seeks. And religion, whatever its flaws may be, whatever its confusions, and Wittgenstein says disobliging things along the way about various particular styles of religion, styles of being religious, it seems to be doing that a little bit more honestly. And it's got a picture in particular of virtue, what a life should be like, what purity would be like if one could achieve it in a life, what grace would be like if one could achieve it in a life. And so when he seeks out religious figures, so Tolstoy is mentioned along the way, the Gospel is, in brief, is something that he reads while he's a soldier in the First World War. Over the course of his life, he doesn't seem to have been particularly drawn to any Eastern forms of religion or spirituality, which is interesting. So many others in that same period were, and Wittgenstein seems to have been largely immune to their attractions. What he does seem to have been drawn to is a certain very austere, sparse, almost ascetic kind of Christianity, the kind of thing that Tolstoy was attracted to. And look at a rough contemporary, someone like Gandhi was also reading Tolstoy at the same point and being attracted to some of that same vision of sparseness and austerity. So whenever he sees anything that seems to him redundant, in excess, smacking of luxury or opulence, he seems to bridle against that. And perhaps it's because he associates that with the luxury of his childhood and his upbringing and the Palais Wittgenstein and that world of Baroque Vienna. And he doesn't like that stuff. And he's going for something more bare, stripped down. And that's true of much of the philosophy, the way in which it's constructed, the way in which it's written, the way in which he lives. Those deck chairs, for instance, that's not just a budgetary choice that Jarman made. He, in fact, had a bunch of deck chairs in his rooms in Trinity College, Cambridge, and that's what guests would be asked to sit on. That single bed he sleeps on, that was the bed. I think it's possible to go and see it in Norway, though I haven't myself. That desire for life to be stripped down and anything extraneous taken out, that seems a more basic impulse. And it seems to have taken him in the direction of a particular kind of religion.
One of the things it seems to me the film wants to suggest, and this is a conventional view of Wittgenstein, is that he was pretty unworldly in various ways. So not merely drawn to various kinds of mysticism, but in a more conventional sense. He was unworldly about the Soviet Union. The scene with the Soviet embassy is quite funny. He was unworldly about the working classes. He had a naive, idealistic view of all sorts of things that then didn't stand up to much of a brush with reality. And it's part of the myth of Wittgenstein, and again, part of the myth of him as a conventional philosopher. My favorite story, I'm sure it's apocryphal, about the unworldliness of Wittgenstein is that he is said to have gone to a Cambridge train station with a couple of friends. He got on a train, the door shut, the train pulled out of the station, and then he stood there and he banged his head against the door of the train, and people watching assumed this was Wittgenstein being Wittgenstein, and he was tortured by some puzzle of philosophical logic, and someone went up to him and said, are you all right, Mr. Wittgenstein? And he said, I was meant to be seeing them off. So that's a classic philosopher as unworldly figure story. It could probably be told about all sorts of Cambridge academics, including me. But I think what this film conveys quite well is that there's another way of viewing it, which is that there's something a little unworldly about Keynes and Russell. You touched on this. Russell's life repels people a little bit now because they're like kids in a candy shop. And Keynes too, the really worldly one. We see Keynes with his map of the world, putting the jigsaw pieces together. That's what he was doing at the end of the Second World War. He was rebuilding a world. Keynes was meant to be the one who knew how money worked. Keynes was the one who knew how power worked. And yet seen in this film in the sort of Bloomsbury, Cambridge context, Wittgenstein is the one out there in the world, and Russell with Lady Ottoline Morale, and Keynes with Lydia, his wife, the ballerina, they're the ones in the gilded cage. And actually, I think this film conveys quite effectively that alongside the unworldly Wittgenstein, for a philosopher, he was much more in the world than many of his contemporaries. Do you think that's fair?
I think what he might be saying is that this concept of worldliness is not as straightforward as we might think to start with. I mean, is one more worldly because one understands money and power, or is one more worldly because one sees that money and power don't matter ultimately? They're not the really important things. One might think, right? Someone with a certain kind of religious worldview is going to say that what Wittgenstein has here is a deeper sort of worldliness. He's seen through some of these elements of bourgeois life. And in fact, despite the fact that he was no serious ideological sense a Marxist, he does frequently use the word bourgeois as a term of criticism. He describes someone like Keynes as basically a bourgeois thinker, insofar as he just wants to tinker around without asking questions about fundamental things. And Wittgenstein, wanted to ask those questions about the fundamental things. And you might think that's a sort of worldliness. It's a sort of realism. It's a particular kind of honesty which tries to hold at bay certain sources or temptations to dishonesty that people like Russell and Keynes were in different ways susceptible to.
One of the examples of his, I don't know if it's his worldly unworldliness or his unworldly worldliness, is he did give all his money away, but he gave it away to his brothers and his sisters.
Who didn't need it. Yeah.
Who didn't need it because he thought they were so rich it wouldn't corrupt them.
Yeah.
Whereas if he gave it to people who really needed it, it would be bad for them. Right. And it's very Wittgenstein. It's quite hard to know what to make of that. Is that an example of someone who has thought it through, in a sense, or actually someone who is almost a child?
Yes. What it does suggest is, I think, a difficulty in distinguishing moral seriousness from moralism. And he's a deeply moralistic person. Everything becomes a matter of moral judgment, even quite trivial things that other people would be inclined to let pass, he would make into a moral matter. So he would always be, the bit where he says to Russell, our friendship is over. He was the sort of person the sort of friend with whom one has a breakup. That's the only way he can relate to people. This idea of something shallower, something with less intensity, I think he can barely make sense of. There's a remark which could easily have made it into the film but doesn't, is when one of his friends or colleagues says something like, the trouble with you, Wittgenstein, is that you want to be perfect. He says, yes, of course I do, with the air of doesn't everyone? And the idea that there are people who are just at ease with their own imperfections, I think, would have been entirely foreign to him.
What do you think The Martian is doing in the film?
I suspect some people in the audience might have their theories, a hypothesis to put forward afterwards, and I'd be very keen on hearing them. Here's one possibility, that it has less to do with Wittgenstein than it does to do with Jarman. Now, I don't for a moment want to put myself forward as some sort of expert on the cinema of Jarman, but one element, a very important element in all of Jarman's work is, of course, how he plays with campness. And now, in the most obvious sense of the word, Wittgenstein is not camp at all. In another sense, he's actually quite camp, right? He has mannerisms. He has a certain way of being in the world that's just a little bit self-dramatizing, a little bit more intense than he has to be. And it's possible, I think, to see that as a form of campness. There's something of artifice in it, which makes it no surprise that it was so widely imitated. People wearing the same kinds of shirts without a tie and a jacket, and certain movements of the body, and a certain way of stammering, and a certain way of looking at the roof and saying, I can't find the words for this, and there's a feeling like that's the affect you're trying to convey. You might describe that as camp, and perhaps the alien, the Martian figure, is a way of introducing that, a kind of a mirror figure who follows Wittgenstein all the way through his life, but is more explicitly, flamboyantly, colourfully camp. In a way that Wittgenstein throughout, just look at the clothes he wears, is a much more monochrome figure. And I thought maybe it was a way of trying to bring out this. There's one way in which Wittgenstein is queer. Indeed, it is one of his words, and often he uses it in the old-fashioned sense of strange, odd, unconventional. And it appears throughout his works, his diaries, his remarks. He's quite fond of these slightly quaint locutions. He likes to say, I'm a worm, I'm a swine. He sort of picked them up from some undergraduate at Cambridge, and he'd sort of fall in love with them and use them every chance he could get. And there is something camp about that, but the alien could reflect that. But something else the alien could be is, I suppose, a way of representing what philosophy can often seem like to a lot of people who are not confronted with it daily, which is an attempt to estrange ourselves from everything we actually know about ourselves, the social world, human life, and to look at it as if one is not in fact a human being, to look at a human practice and then sort of describe it in terms that might equally make sense to a Martian, someone unaware of, to use that very characteristically Wittgensteinian phrase, our form of life. And perhaps that's what it's meant to be. And so it's this figure who, by standing outside of human life, is able to see it in a light that we who are actually living it can't see it. And the thing about Wittgenstein is that he goes back and forth between someone who just wants to be human, not afflicted by these thoughts that take him outside of human modes of thinking, but someone who nevertheless finds himself engaging in exactly that, becoming alien to himself.
The philosopher and historian of science, Ian Hacking, he wrote a celebrated paper long after this film, so it can't have been the inspiration for the film, which was called Humans, Aliens and Autism, which draws very heavily on Wittgenstein. And it explores the idea, particularly for autistic children, a trope, as he calls it, that neurotypical people tend to view autistic children as in some sense alien, but also autistic children often view neurotypical people as alien. And the phrase Hacking uses is because they do not share a form of life. Yeah. And it's to do with language and the unknowability of language, particularly of nonverbal communication, and the ways in which communication through nonverbal signs can seem inaccessible. There has been a lot of inevitable, I think, speculation about Wittgenstein and the ways in which he was probably autistic, not neurotypical. It's probably reading it backwards, but do you think the alien may have something to do with that?
Yes, I like that hypothesis. So if the idea is that the world seems strange to Wittgenstein in ways that it doesn't seem to most people, the neurotypical, and a lot of his philosophy then is animated by both the desire to explore what it is, this alienness, this alien perspective, and then somehow also to shed it, to be able to enter into that form of life and be one with everyone else. So perhaps all that stuff about, I want to go and be a manual worker is just a deep desire to be ordinary, or we might say a deep desire to be normal, or you might now say a desire to be neurotypical.
I think one of the things that the film does beautifully, actually, is it captures the arc of his philosophical life away from the thought that he could get it all down in language in a way that answers the problems of philosophy, or at least says what is soluble in philosophy, the earlier work, to the later work in which he is much more focused on what you might call the public language and the ways in which actually our experiences are going to have to be ones in which we share some cultural and other commonalities, and we will play these language games together, and you just can't do it on your own. There's something solitary at the start about the philosophical endeavor, and as he moves through his life, it becomes something more public and in a sense can only be done communally. And yet it also captures that in his own life, that journey was awful for him. And I think Keynes's little allegory at the end is quite moving in that respect. The boy who created the world of ice and then realized actually the world has to be rough, it has to be complicated, but is hankering for that nostalgia, has that sense of nostalgia for the ice. Do you think that is the arc of, not of Wittgenstein's life, but of his philosophy, in the sense it's away from the purity to something much more, in a way, mundane, complicated, but also public and shared? And yet he was a human being who, for all the reasons that we've discussed, found that way of living, the chat, it beautifully captures right at the end his loathing of public language. I mean, it disgusts him, and his philosophy has taken him to a place where that's all that's left.
Yes, I think that's quite a striking and useful way of connecting what are otherwise quite disparate aspects of both his life and his philosophical work. So just to give a bit of the intellectual context here, the figure who he holds up repeatedly, I think explicitly in the film as the kind of hobby horse, the figure against whom he's contrasting himself, is Descartes. Right? Descartes being the figure who, in the 17th century, tries to show that our intellectual activities, including science, including theology and religion, need to be put on a firm, logical footing of certainty. But the thing is, everything about the external world, the world outside our minds, can be doubted. It can be doubted because of, we might be hallucinating it, it might be an evil demon deceiving us. We can never be sure there isn't an evil demon or a malevolent artificial intelligence or whatever it is messing around with our senses, so we can't trust them. We can't even trust that other people exist. So you've got to start from yourself, from the privacy of the individual mind. Hence the famous cogito, I think, is the one thing that I can know certainly, because even to doubt it, I have to be thinking. And in Descartes, the project is to start from that idea of the cogito, I think, and move outward and say, now that I've shown that, let's see how I might then be able to prove the existence of God, and then by proving the existence of God, then prove the existence of the external world, chairs, tables, other human beings. And I think Wittgenstein comes to think that this is getting things exactly the wrong way around. The idea that there is this private sphere of the mind, separate from the body, that is known to the person but not to anyone else, the whole thing is folly. You've got to start exactly the other way around. Start from within a form of life in which there are already other people. And really what we have to learn is how to be private, how to keep our thoughts to ourselves. So you think of thought not as something that's first private and then made public, but as something that starts public, and then some of us learn how to keep it private. The trouble is that Cartesian way of thinking comes very naturally to Wittgenstein. He does seem, as we would say, using an idiom that he would perhaps dislike, trapped in his own head a lot of the time. And which is why it seems he seeks anything that'll get him outside of himself. Sometimes it's these daunting, wild landscapes of Norway, a rural island. Sometimes it's going off to the cinema and watching Carmen Miranda with her feather boa, and something that will stop him being caught up in his own head by directing his attention to something striking outside of it. So I think it's fair to say what you did. This is what he wants. He wants to be in what he calls the rough ground, not the frictionless ice, but somehow he keeps being drawn back to it. And that might be the place where we need the psychoanalytic interpretation. We need something that's not purely philosophical. Why is he constantly drawn back to the very thing he so abhors?
Do you think that was a good portrayal of Wittgenstein? I've totally blanked on the name of the actor.
Carl Johnson.
Carl Johnson. Did it convince you? He looks pretty good. It's a much better lookalike than Russell.
Yeah.
Keynes.
They didn't really
I thought the
try.
Keynes representation was quite good too, but he certainly looks the part. Do you think Wittgenstein was like that?
Well, the trouble is, we don't have any recordings, video or audio of his voice, right? So this is what we have. For what it's worth, I have it at about third hand from someone at Cambridge who knew someone at Cambridge who knew someone who had met Wittgenstein, that it was uncanny. That he'd really, I mean, he's clearly a very carefully crafted performance. He's thought very hard. There are little things, features of the way in which he stammers when he's thinking, a certain kind of wry smile, a certain impassivity followed by some kind of grimaces of intensity. I mean, these are things we have records of. It's one of the striking things about Wittgenstein. There's actually a 2-volume book you can get, which is simply people's anecdotes of meeting Wittgenstein. Some of them are philosophically interesting, some of them aren't. I mean, one of them is simply, there's a philosophy conference happening in possibly Birmingham, and a philosopher goes there and he sees this young man who looks like an Austrian hiker, because he's dressed like one. And he goes to him and says, "I'm afraid there is to be a meeting of philosophers here." And Wittgenstein replies, "I too am afraid." You really get that sense of that he's read them. He's read all these anecdotes. There's some people who collect them, right? Aphorisms and anecdotes, Oscar Wilde, Churchill maybe, Gandhi certainly again. Everyone who meets these people seems to have written down what it was like to be in their presence. Wittgenstein was like that. I mean, it's how many people could you fill 2 whole books with anecdotes of? So this performance, I think, is entirely consistent with everything that is known of him, at least that I know of him. And that's what makes it feel uncanny, even to me, who doesn't have any independent way of knowing what he was like. But I should also say, because now I've watched this film 3 times now, it has become my inner picture of Wittgenstein, as often happens, right? You see the film version, and now that's just how you picture them. And because in this case we have no other picture of him, I now hear the words of Wittgenstein, his published works, in the voice of Carl Johnson. So one very much hopes that he got it as right as I've been told he did.
Finally, and I genuinely don't know the answer to this question, what is Wittgenstein's standing as a philosopher today? So when I was a student, admittedly it was at Cambridge, but when I was a student, he was still talked about as a kind of god of some kind. He really, his name was there in the lists with Descartes and Kant and the others, the great lists of philosophy which go back to Aristotle, whom he never read, would include Wittgenstein. Is that still true?
I think his reputation isn't what it used to be. I think it would be fair to say that. It's rare, I think, to find a philosopher in academic employment who would openly admit to being a Wittgensteinian, or as one might say, a card-carrying Wittgensteinian. But there used to be such people. Many of them were at Cambridge. A smaller group of them were at Swansea, which is somehow a centre of Wittgensteinianism, if you like. There were journals, people writing in that style. They all wear the same jackets and they talk like him. And some of them mysteriously, despite being from, Anglesey, began to speak in a Viennese accent. So those were things that used to happen. I see very little of that anymore. I think there's been a process of what you might call the domestication of Wittgenstein, at least since the 1950s. So when Wittgenstein died, he hadn't actually managed to complete the book that he's described as working on in that bit of the cottage in Ireland. But it was put together by one of his students, someone called Elizabeth Anscombe. She put together this book out of many, many drafts, many, many versions of them. And it was published in 1953 with his German text on the left and her English translation on the right. After it came out, it wasn't possible, I think, for it to be a sort of hermetic, closed circle of initiates, of acolytes, people who had these typescripts that were passed on like a bit of samizdat in the Soviet Union, or secret text. It really was treated like that. Wittgenstein took it very badly if he found that someone had shared one of his ideas without his permission or approval, and he very seldom gave his permission or approval. When the philosopher Mary Midgley wrote a piece in the New Statesman, he was furious. He was trying to get it taken off the stands. That's how furious he was about it. But then he was dead, and then his ideas were on paper, and then people were going to do with it what they would do with it. So people start writing about it in a style utterly unlike his own. So it wasn't full of these strange, tortured reflections on bits of language, strange puzzles, questions that are never answered, answers which it's hard to trace back to any question, arguments which have premises but no conclusions, conclusions but no premises. That's his style. That's how he wrote. That's how he seems to have thought. That's how he almost performed his philosophy. That's not how you get published. Even in the 50s, that was true. You have to write a paper that says, in this paper, I will argue, and in section 1, I will say, and in section 2, I will consider. And that sort of style, in many ways, is anathema. You can't be Wittgensteinian within that style. So what you get is something that makes use of Wittgenstein. It appropriates Wittgenstein. It takes little remarks here, remarks there, and turns it into a style and idiom that were not his style or his idiom, but can be traced back to things he'd originally said. So I think that's what survives of him. Practicing academic philosophers will be able to quote some of his best-known lines. They'll be able to tell you something reasonably sensible about what the private language argument is and what it does or doesn't show. But the idea that someone is trying actually to live as a Wittgensteinian, I think, would be seen as faintly risible today if anyone tried it.
So it's at least possible that in 50 years' time, this film will have more cachet than the philosophical investigations.
Yeah, there's some possibility that that's true, right? And Jarman might be the figure who really comes out of it as the figure of influence.
So I'll have to confess that I don't like the film. And the reason I don't like the film is I think it has this way of glorifying the philosopher as arsehole. By which I mean specifically, there's a kind of two-way street here. One, that it's almost as if Wittgenstein's genius was bound up intimately within being a horrible person to other people. And this was necessary, that he couldn't have been a genius if he hadn't also been awful to other people. And the other way, but we can let him off being awful. We let him off being an arsehole because he was a genius. And there's this kind of view that, and that's the price one has to pay for philosophical greatness. And, you know, they come as two sides of the same coin. And I actually think, if anything, the film undersells how awful he could be. And if you want the, in some ways, perhaps more accurate version, Cheryl Misak's biography of Frank Ramsey, who was a contemporary of Wittgenstein's, died at 26, having already revolutionized areas of philosophy, decision theory, economics, and mathematics. But by all accounts, was a really nice person with a good sense of humor. And if Misak is to be believed, actually influenced Wittgenstein far more than Wittgenstein let on, we may never have got the philosophical investigations if it weren't for Frank Ramsey, the sort of 23-year-old correcting Wittgenstein. And so I find it frustrating that this vision of Wittgenstein as the necessary arsehole philosopher is perpetuated by things like this film. And it goes back to what you said, David, at the start about, is it the myth of Wittgenstein himself? Does it outstrip his ideas? And I suspect yes, but the fault isn't necessarily Wittgenstein's. It's this desire we seem to have to think the great philosopher must be a bad person in some ways, a bit like Nietzsche is the other kind of classic example here. So I would say that's a bit of pushback on the film. And it feeds the wrong mythos, but there we go.
I mean, saints are sometimes arseholes. The necessary arsehole philosopher as a category, Nikhil.
I mean, I'd be interested to hear if other people got that impression as well, right? It's very hard. I mean, I come to this as someone who's sort of steeped in that mythos. But one thing you could say is, however horrible he was to other people, he seems to have been worse to himself. I don't know how much that forgives or excuses or mitigates the extent of it, but it seems like he was almost nicer to other people than he was to himself. That's something. The other thing I think I want to say in defense of this is Derek Jarman, the people involved in it, they're only slightly interested in the ideas, right? To some degree, the author of the original version of the script, the literary critic Terry Eagleton, is interested in the ideas, but having read his original version of the script and his remarks about it, I do have to say about every paragraph includes some sort of philosophical misunderstanding. So I wouldn't take it too seriously as a kind of authoritative source or interpretation of those ideas. But what I think it brings out very nicely is that the way in which Wittgenstein is received, I think, is not so much as a genius, but as a sort of eccentric foreigner, and to be indulged for that reason. And Jarman, I think, is clearly interested in it for that. And this is a sort of very English thing, right? You go for the character. And the trouble with a lot of philosophers in all periods is that they are disappointingly dull. They're disappointingly normal. They're disappointingly, you might say, nice. And nice is certainly not a thing you want to say about Wittgenstein. He strove to be good. He strove to be holy. He strove to be pious. He strove to be saintly, but not to be nice. That's too much of a second-rate ideal for second-rate people. And you can have contempt for that, because you might think these bourgeois ideals, such as niceness, are perfectly honorable ones to pursue in one's life. But that's not Wittgenstein's thing. So you might want to go in the direction of saying, yep, it just confirms to me my own bourgeois prejudices against this sort of genius saint figure. Alternatively, you might say, well, what it does is to say something that Wittgenstein himself, as a statement he loved. He once heard his cleaning lady at Cambridge say it. It takes all sorts to make a world. And he said, what a lovely statement, what a lovely statement. But the funny thing about it is he never actually said he agreed with it. He didn't say he thought it was true, but he thought it was a very charming idea nevertheless.
I mean, the other thing I think you could say is this film underplays the extent to which Bertrand Russell was an arsehole, because it actually makes him come across as quite a twinkly, cuddly chap, and he really wasn't. And actually, in many ways, if you look at the two lives, I'd say Russell behaved worse. So I was saying this to Nikhil beforehand. People sometimes say, when you arrive in a town and you want to find the worst behaved people, go to the philosophy department and ask for the ethicists.
Wittgenstein's world, as represented in the film, is a very masculine world. Male friends, male students, mentors. And yet, Nikhil, you mentioned that he was very protective about his work, but he let Elizabeth Anscombe translate. And so I'm just wondering, does the film not do justice to the kind of women philosophers that Wittgenstein had connections with? And, in general, there's a line in the film that, you're the philosopher, I'm the woman. And, does that really represent the Cambridge of the first half of the 20th century? Or is this a kind of misrepresentation? Welcome, any thoughts on that?
The conventional view is, yes, it was a masculine place, very homosocial, in some cases actively homoerotic, and perhaps some of these features are what draw Jarman himself to it. One more kind of homosocial space, a bit like, if you know his film about St. Sebastian, the martyrdom St. Sebastian, which borderline pornographic, full frontal nudity, lots of Roman soldiers cavorting naked in the dust, etc. So perhaps there's some attraction to that kind of vision. In fact, there's quite a lot of research over the last 15 or 20 years which say that that was a distortion of what it was really like. So there's work by a philosopher called Sophia Connell, who's been looking into the people whom Wittgenstein supervised as a PhD supervisor at Cambridge once he got his professorship there, and there were a surprising number of women, many, many more than you'd expect. There's people who'd say, Anscombe was unique, she became the honorary man, admitted to the inner circle when no one else was. That isn't true at all. There are several others, someone else called Alice Ambrose, who he took very seriously and regarded very highly, and then they had a horrible falling out because she wanted to do something really horrible, which was apply for a job. And Wittgenstein refused and said these horrible bourgeois preoccupations like jobs. And she said, well, not all of us are Viennese aristocrats, Wittgenstein. And that was it. She got cancelled. So there were fallings out with them as with everyone else. But that suggests, again, he doesn't appear to have been distinctively misogynist in his treatment of them. It just seemed he was just as nasty to them as he was to many of his male students. And in some ways, he seems to have been less so to at least some of them, such as the aforementioned Anscombe, who he seems to have regarded very, very highly and respected her enormously. It's not merely that he let her translate it, he asked her to. He decided that no one else could be trusted with the task, so he sent her off to Vienna to master Viennese dialect so she'd get all the slang and the subtle references. And she's one of those who's supposed to have come away with a slight Viennese accent in her English after that.
He was privileged, and then you want to pull people down because you've experienced the privilege and you don't even have the sense or realization to think it was almost controlling to try and get the young man to
give up philosophy and become a worker.
Exactly, yeah.
There's a couple of things. Just one thing worth saying here is that the Johnny character in that film isn't...
He's an amalgam.
He's an amalgam, exactly, of various people we know. So there's a little bit of Frank Ramsey, the figure we just mentioned, but it's a combination of someone called David Pinsent, the person to whom his first book, the Tractatus, is dedicated, someone who died in a flight accident during the First World War, and Wittgenstein only found out about it afterwards. Maybe saying he was his lover or boyfriend would be going too far, but he certainly loved him very dearly. And then later there was Francis Skinner. That was the person with whom he tried to go off to the Soviet Union and be a manual worker. Later on in life, there was someone called Ben Richards, who was a medical student, and they exchanged many, many very loving letters, which are going to be published for the first time, actually, in English next year by Bloomsbury. So that's a book that I'm very much looking forward to. So we have accounts of these relations he had with them, and they were often what you might call toxic. They were manipulative. They involved the imposition of values that those young men often didn't share. But then Wittgenstein had a sort of type. He liked people who were a little bit ingenuous, a little bit naive, a little bit vulnerable, because he saw in them a kind of innocence that I think he wanted in himself. But you can put that in a much less charitable way than I just have. The other thing there is every time he found himself in society, I think he partly came to loathe himself for how he behaved in their presence. And perhaps that constant desire to throw off society and go off to secluded wildernesses partly comes out of the sense of self-loathing, sense of guilt and self-consciousness as to how he behaves when he is around other people, the way in which he uses his power over other people. So perhaps the person who'd be likeliest to respond to you would be he himself.
You get the impression with Wittgenstein that at least Cambridge was the place where he could be sort of curated and sort of, even though he didn't like it.
It was a remark that was made about Gandhi, whom I've referred to a few times, that it cost a fortune to keep him in poverty. And it's a little bit like that. I mean, there's a sort of holy poverty that he seeks, but it turns out that he does need to be regularly supplied with a certain kind of intellectual company, conversation, provocation, and somehow he was indulged, as most people with those qualities are not. There are other figures in that tradition of neuroatypical philosopher, often indulged by institutions. In recent memory, of someone I've actually met, was the philosopher Derek Parfit, of whom a very interesting biography was published a couple of years ago by David Edmonds. Someone else who, as his life went on, became stranger and stranger and was indulged, treated as a genius, allowed to behave in ways that very few. Because there was a sort of innocence and saintliness about him, he, as it were, got away with it. And he was taken very, very seriously, but a case could be made that perhaps academia does this far too often. We're very aware of this pattern in the context of abuse and harassment. But when it doesn't take that really obvious form where we can sort of bring the police in and so say this person was a predator, it's a bit harder to know what we want to say about them. But perhaps the indulgence of the genius is a way of trying to say what we want to say, even though it doesn't quite fall foul of any law that we can name.
You could say he belonged in an institution, and I'm afraid Oxford and Cambridge colleges are those institutions.
I was really intrigued by how sort of easily he left behind his earlier scientific career. I think it was aeronautics. And then he was unable to ever sort of turn his back on philosophy to the extent that it did drive him crazy, or it seemed. But by marrying together that sort of scientific understanding and, I suppose, his philosophical confusion, would that not have solved the troubles that he was confronting with these inexplicable ideas that he sort of couldn't convey to anybody, this idea that he couldn't solve philosophy? If he'd have sort of revived that scientific grounding, would that not have changed the course of his philosophy?
I was just curious that for a man who was so caught up in his own head about philosophy, he seemed intensely relaxed in some ways about politics. You know, one thing I thought was striking is he was so eager to participate in World War I when he was exempt, yet at the cinema was so dismissive of the kind of nationalist patriotism which animated the kind of person who would participate in World War I. He wants to participate in Soviet communism as a worker, and then seems to kind of almost, with a sort of almost wink and a nod, be dismissive of Bertrand Russell's retort. He says he's as dismissive of Cambridge as he was working in the provincial schools, but he spent a lot more time in Cambridge than he did those provincial schools. So I wonder, how do we square someone who locates philosophy in the collective rather than the individual, being, in a way, so intensely unbothered about the collective enterprise of politics?
Two very good questions. So first, if he hadn't given up on science?
Well, in one way, it was never science as inquiry that he was interested in. I think he quite liked engineering. He liked mechanics. He liked fixing things. And I think he continued to be interested in that for the rest of his life. Even during the Second World War, when he was too old to be a soldier again, he first volunteered to be a hospital porter. And then he was asked to, I can't remember the precise word for it, the person who sort of mixes up medicines, for which I don't think he had any formal qualifications, but he was apparently extremely good at it, very thorough, very careful. And so for him, maybe that sort of mechanical activity, trying to work out how a machine works, repairing someone's car, changing their tires, he really liked that sort of thing. And so the attraction to manual work perhaps is precisely that it took him out of his head like nothing else. And you wish maybe, as you said, that you'd done a little bit more of it. It may just have been that the way in which philosophy was an affliction for him meant that he couldn't throw that off. On politics, you're quite right that his reasons for wanting to enlist in the Austro-Hungarian army in the First World War appear not to have been in the least nationalistic. I think he'd have fought for anyone, because I think he saw it as a kind of crucible, a place in which he might achieve virtue, achieve saintliness, achieve maybe martyrdom. In some ways, there's a remark, I think Enoch Powell, notoriously, was once asked if he had any regrets in his life, and he said, I would like to have died in the war. And I think Wittgenstein was a bit like that. A noble death had for him a sort of grandeur that a mere life, certainly an academic life, could never have. And politics, because it's about sharing power, it's sort of doing business and grubby deals and negotiating and compromising. And these are all the things he didn't want, precisely because he had these aspirations to, not heroism exactly, but saintliness. Means that there was never going to be room for anything that, politics is not a place for saints. And because he sought to be saintly in this way, the kinds of activities he sought were either, let me go and be a manual worker in a factory, or let me be a soldier who dies nobly. It seems like there was nothing in the middle. It just didn't make sense to him that there was anything in the middle. That's why it's either intense, very abstract philosophy, or incredibly lowbrow cowboy movies. Nothing in the middle.
So this is not the time to open this conversation because we could talk about it for hours. Politics is no place for saints, but Gandhi was pretty good at it.
Yeah, and you might say that he was good at it to the extent that he was not a saint.
The film was also interesting. There's a little bit in it where Russell is lying on the bed with Ottiline Morel and they get the letter and she says, does he know you've been in prison too? And Russell was in prison during the First World War because he was an objector. And Russell was an arsehole. And he was wrong about lots of things, including lots of questions of personal morality. But my God, he was right about the Soviet Union, and he was right about the First World War. And Wittgenstein was wrong about the Soviet Union. And Wittgenstein seemed to think of the First World War as something that existed for him. Yeah. It was like, oh, this is a useful war for me because I would like to know what it's like to be under fire. Yeah. And there is something really monstrous about that. I mean,
so if you're
really
looking for a
monstrous
diagnostic category, perhaps the real 20th century term we want for him is narcissism then.
And the philosopher's narcissist, that is a category for sure. Next time in our Films of Ideas series, I am talking to the film director and also campaigner against the power of big tech, Beeban Kidron, about a film that features in many people's all-time favourite lists. It's a film that's remembered as very romantic, it's a tearjerker, it's moving, but it's also profound, and in some ways, it's deeply prophetic. We're going to be discussing Eternal Sunshine of the Spotless Mind. That's next time. This has been Past, Present, Future.